Good afternoon. Come on in the back, join us. My name is Ryan McEwen. I'm Associate Professor at the University of Dayton, and I'm this year's Program Chair for the annual meeting. And it's my pleasure again to welcome you to Louisville, to the Commonwealth of Kentucky. I hope that you're building bridges in your scientific community and are invigorated and excited by the program. One of the thrills and honors of being Program Chair is you're allowed to select the Recent Advances Lecturer. And the idea is that you're going to bring someone who is innovating, doing exciting new work in the field and pushing the society forward. And so I was overjoyed when our guest speaker today, Robin Wall Kimmerer, agreed to give this presentation. Robin Wall Kimmerer is a mother, scientist, writer, and distinguished teaching professor of environmental biology at the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. She is also a citizen of the Potawatomi Nation. She is a founding director of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, whose mission is to create programs which draw on the wisdom of both indigenous and scientific knowledge for our shared goals of sustainability. Kimmerer is co-founder and first president of ESA's traditional ecological knowledge section. She is the author of 2 books and many articles. The first book is Gathering Moss, which won the John Burroughs Medal. She's also author of Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants. Her interests include not only restoration of ecological communities, but restoration of our relationships to land. So please help me welcome our guest speaker and the Recent Advances Lecturer, Robin Wall Kimmerer.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Yeah. Bonjour. Shabadaske gish kokwena deshnakas. Bodwe wadmi kwenda. Magaze dodem minwa mako dodem. Nin mami kwendem mampi yayan. I don't speak very much of my Potawatomi language, but it is an endangered species, and our teachers ask us to breathe life into it every chance we get. And it is incredibly relevant to our discussion here today. In that traditional protocol greeting, which we always use, I told you that I'm a member of the Bear Clan and of the Eagles as well in the Potawatomi Nation, that I'm a Potawatomi Anishinaabe woman, and that my name in our language is the light shining through Sky Woman. The reason these traditional protocols are so very important is that unlike in Western society, in Western science, where we really prize and believe in strict objectivity, in indigenous ways of knowing, we doubt the possibility of separating fully the observer and the observed. And so it's very important that we always introduce ourselves so that our listeners will know from what perspective the information is being shared. I also want to begin with gratitude to all of you for being here, for the more than human beings that shower us with gifts every day, for the privilege of our shared work as ecologists, and for the Ecological Society for this invitation. I'm really honored to play this role. I also want to give, importantly, territorial acknowledgement to the fact that we sit today in the ancestral homelands of the Shawnee people, to whom we owe a debt of history, to whom we owe a debt of land, and indeed in this community, to whom we owe a debt of ecological knowledge. And you know, when I was asked to give this talk, I really had to laugh because I've been coming to ESA for a long time, and I remember back as a graduate student coming to lectures like this, the plenaries, and thinking, wow, those are the opportunities where they ask people with really gray hair to come and stand for it. Who would have thought that I would one day be here? But it also seems really fitting because I'm an academic grandma now. You know, my grad students have grad students, as well as a grandmother in the familial sense. And so it seems important to play that role of, in our language, of nokomis to our community. And you're probably aware of the really interesting new research that's coming about the evolutionary importance of grandmothers in fitness of cultures and cultural change, which is the theme of my talk today. I also want to say that I am so proud to be an ESA member in this theme of inclusion as an ecological imperative. The fact that we have a TEK section, an education section, a natural history section, environmental justice, outreach, the SEEDS program, that we are really embodying this notion of inclusion. And I invite you all to be part of the ongoing expansion of what does that really mean. And it's also important that here we stand on almost the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And despite the tremendous progress that we know that we have made collectively, it pains me to recognize that we are still facing some of the same challenges that propelled our work nearly 50 years ago. There has not been sufficient cultural evolution to align our social values with ecological law. And that really brings us to the question of how might we as ecologists accelerate that cultural evolution. I don't know about you, but I used to be one of those people who said, well, if people only knew, they would change their ways. Right? I think that's a mantra we've all used, that if people had more information, if they had more facts, cultural evolution would propel, we would be propelled into that much faster. But there are many studies, this one from AAAS very recently, suggesting that, in fact, that is not the case. More information does not lead to the cultural change that we need. And I have become convinced as a teacher, as a writer, as a scientist, that it's honestly not more data that we need, not more money that we need, but what we lack is a change of heart. We are in the midst of a crisis of values. What we really need is wisdom. And in these urgent times, we don't have to list how urgent these times are. We know that the privilege of being ecologists, of being scientists, we have the tools and we have the capacity to be change makers, but the question is, how can we do ecology in such a way that really propels that change? And the urgent issues that we face, we know lie at this intersection of nature and culture. And scientific knowledge alone is not going to propel that change. And Western scholars are increasingly recognizing, as you know, that indigenous worldviews, which were once targeted for erasure, are essential elements of the transformation towards sustainability. And such a shift requires that we continue to broaden participation in ecology. And that will be part of our theme, not all today. We know that we are all engaged in our mission of understanding and indeed defending biodiversity, which we think of as genetic diversity, as species diversity, as landscape diversity. But what I'm hoping that we can really focus on today is our role in engagement with knowledge diversity. Because every one of us, as ecologists, know the ecological consequences of monoculture, no. But let's also think about what are the cultural consequences of an intellectual monoculture, which unfortunately many scientific institutions continue to propagate. We all teach our students in Bio 101 that biological evolution is fueled by genetic diversity. Thus, this notion of cultural evolution towards sustainability is fueled by intellectual diversity. The bottom line is that the innovation that we need requires full participation and authentic participation as well. Now, we'll more to say about what I mean by authentic engagement in just a minute. Now, you might expect that in a talk like this, you would see a fair amount of data. I think this is 99% data-free. Instead, what I'm going to do is to try to use those tools which have been called the most sophisticated communication technologies on the planet. And my students say, oh, you mean our phones? And I don't mean that. I mean stories. So let me tell you a story about a young Potawatomi ecologist going off to college in September many, many years ago. And I was going to the College of Forestry, and I knew I would be one of the only women there and certainly the only Native woman there. And so I really wanted to make a good impression. And when my advisor said to me on my freshman interview, "So, Miss Wall, why do you want to be a botanist, an ecologist?" I told him about my love for goldenrod and asters. And in fact, I said, I want to know why they grow together. I want to know why they are so beautiful. And he said, "My dear, that is not science. If you're interested in beauty, you should have gone to art school." So I tried again. I asked questions about, I wanted to know why the plants made medicines for us and why willows bent really well for baskets, but maple just split. And he said, "Oh no, those are questions of anthropology. If you wanted to study people, you shouldn't have come to a botany department." And all of this, of course, is why I looked so happy in my freshman photo, which was exactly the same day. I realized I had made, or I thought I had made, a big mistake, that I was trying to enter a club to which I did not belong. That my very understanding of what it meant to be a scientist, to be an ecologist, was being challenged in that moment. And I have to tell you, I really struggled in my freshman year because of that sense of not belonging, that this was really not my world. Because I had wandered from the indigenous worldview into the scientific worldview, from the indigenous paradigm in which those plants are understood as our teachers, as our relatives, as our respected companions, nature as subject, nature made up of persons. And I had wandered into the ecology classroom where this was the model of an ecosystem, the notion of nature as machine, with human beings outside it, save being the mechanic. And in moving between these two worldviews, these ways of knowing was a tremendous challenge for me. But I loved plants so much, I loved ecology, that I persevered, but I was asked to leave behind all of my other ideas from an indigenous perspective at the door. I encountered a worldview in which land was understood in these familiar definitions as property, as capital, as natural resources, what Native people call our relatives, natural resources, land as a source of ecosystem services, when in fact I had been brought up in a culture where land was inseparable from identity, where land was understood as our sustainer, the residence of our non-human relatives, our ancestral connections. Land was a source of knowledge. It was the library. It was the pharmacy. Land was inspirited. Land as home. Land not as the place for which we have property rights, but land as the place for which we have moral responsibility. And the notion of land as sacred. And so this created for me an uphill battle that reminded me of my grandfather's first day at school in higher education. As a 9-year-old Potawatomi boy taken from his family in Oklahoma, put on the train to the Carlisle Indian School, where he too was told that his ideas didn't matter. This is the beginning of education as assimilation, education as erasure. So I am so proud to tell you that right down the hall from the place where I was told I was in the wrong place, we now have the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, whose mission is to bring together both ways of knowing, Western scientific tools and indigenous environmental philosophy and practices as well. And the microcosmic story that I'm telling you of my own journey might seem like it was a really long time ago. Oh, the 1% data, here it is. If we look simply at these data about the earned doctorates among Native students, what we see is the experience that I had as a young Native scholar has really not changed. What we see is that that enrollment and participation of Indigenous scholars in STEM disciplines has flat-lined. And there are a lot of causes for that, which we don't have time to go into today. historic poverty, intergenerational trauma, history, educational achievement gaps, all those things that you're familiar with. But what I want to focus on today, and the thing that we as ecologists and educators can do something about, is the marginalization of Indigenous ways of knowing. In pedagogy, in research, in questions, Indigenous knowledge is virtually invisible in most of our higher education institutions. And that matters. I remember being a junior in a forest ecology class when my professor came into the room, was so excited to tell us that scientists had discovered that fire was good for the land. They discovered that. It is laughable, and I laughed at the time, but I could have cried too, as a person of the Potawatomi Nation, known as the people of the fire, to say that all of our history of Indigenous science was missing, and it's only valid when Western scientists discover it, not when people practice it. I too, the Indigenous ways of knowing are holistic. What you're seeing here is a representation simplified of the medicine wheel that reminds us that in knowledge generation, in our teaching, in our decision making, that we humans are gifted with these 4 ways of problem solving, 4 ways of understanding the world. And I had always been taught that we needed to use all of those ways in order to really understand something. But in scientific ways of knowing, as you know, we privilege the mind, the intellect, right? And to some extent, that which we can measure through the body. But we are very, very explicitly excluding emotion and spirit from our work for very important reasons for certain kinds of questions. And so when we think about all of these hurdles, all of these differences between Indigenous knowledge generation and Western scientific knowledge generation, the experience of many students is that STEM education is profoundly assimilative. This is what I mean by authentic inclusion. Not only that we invite different faces into our classrooms, into our labs, into our conferences for all of the ways that we're doing, but that we also invite different ideas into the room, different knowledge systems, so that when we aspire to authentic inclusion, we don't do this, the before and after photos from the Carlisle Indian School. Can we grow as a scientific community and decolonize our approaches to education, research, and the questions that we ask for authentic inclusion? And we are storytelling people who use metaphor, so that's where I'm going to go right now. And to say that within the minds, certainly of many Native communities, many communities of color, and indeed I would say much of the public, the dominant metaphor for Western science could be captured as the fortress. This huge gray edifice on high with big walls and not very many windows, metaphorically speaking. And the knowledge that's generated within that fortress is symbolically seen to dominate the landscape. Let's go a little deeper here. When we think about this fortress, why is this a metaphor for the perception of Western science and sometimes the action of Western science? That fortress is built brick by brick, reductionist knowledge, right? Little units. In fact, our whole meeting is full of such beautiful little units of knowledge. But we don't have to build a fortress out of them. We have choices. But by and large, we do contribute to this metaphor of science. What else? Specialized workers, right? Fortresses have specialized workers. They're not ordinary people. Likewise, the scientific community. There is a materialist approach to knowledge creation that really uses only 2 parts of that medicine wheel, if we're lucky, and amputates the other. Knowledge within those walls of the fortress is often commodified. It is understood as property, as intellectual property, to be bought and sold. And perhaps most importantly, and close to my thinking as a writer, is that much of the way that we communicate those little bricks that we have made, that we could build into anything is with a language and through modalities that really exclude participation by citizenry, right? We all contribute to that. Indeed, it is a convention almost that our papers are readable by one another, but not by the general public. Science is also perceived as a fortress because of its, especially in Native communities, which has so often gotten the short end of the stick from scientific research, where science can, I want to exclude ecologists here, exert power over biological and social systems. It can be an agent of environmental destruction. But most importantly, science is understood as this fortress because of erasure of Indigenous knowledge. It is something of an imperialistic force that devalues other ways of knowing. I can't tell you how many times I have sat in a meeting between tribes and natural resource managers where the natural resource managers, members of the fortress, just kind of wave their hand and roll their eyes at Indigenous knowledge, saying it's not real knowledge, it's not valid knowledge, and has no place in our decision making. This contributes to the intellectual monoculture that I mentioned at the beginning, in which Indigenous science is rendered invisible. And so, when we think about the fact that many scholars have written about this, that modern Western science is inextricably entangled with colonialism, especially when we think about the colonial project as one of erasure of the original Aboriginal institutions and replacement of it. Indigenous science was largely replaced by Western science. And so the question before us is, how do we decolonize? How do we reclaim again and make visible and useful and valid Indigenous ways of knowing? Could we use the tools of Western science without the Western scientific worldview? Could we use the tools of Western science and the perspectives within the Indigenous worldview? I think we can, and that's much of what I want to share with you. All of us who are teachers know that some of our best teachers are our students, right? I think of so many pivot points in my career that have been really instigated by questions and comments from students. So I want to share an example from one of my native grad students who came to study ecological restoration. And this is what she said: when I go back to my community, I don't want to be known as a scientist. I want to be known as somebody working on behalf of land and people. And it was deeply troubling to me that in her mind and in the mind of her community, these weren't the same thing. Because her community, as much of the public, was in fortress metaphor. That's what scientists are. They're part of that fortress. They're not the ones who are doing this work. Why can't we be both? And one of the decolonizing ideas that I'll turn back to in a few moments is that in Indigenous societies, knowledge is inextricably coupled to responsibility for that knowledge, for care, for plants, for people, for land, for culture. And we have to acknowledge that some of the Western science paradigm is knowledge for knowledge's sake, that knowledge is not necessarily coupled to responsibility. And that is an aspect of decolonizing that we really need to think about. I want to tell you just another little story here about these notions of oops, sorry, I wanted to go here. That as we engage Indigenous knowledge, it is not retrospective. It isn't about what we used to do. It is Indigenous knowledge, philosophy, and practices so that we can go forward into sustainability, but shaped by a different worldview, an alternative to this material reductionist scientific worldview. How might we achieve that? And this term sustainability, as we all know, is a shop-worn and slippery term. And the story I want to share with you is of an Algonquin biologist colleague of mine who wanted to go to a sustainability research conference. And so she went to her tribal council to ask for a travel grant. And in this council, they said to her, well, we want you to go and travel and network, but what is sustainability? And she really laughed. She said, well, that's how our people have lived really well in place for the last 4,000 years. And they said, okay, but we don't call it that. What do you mean by sustainability? So she gave them the definitions that we are all familiar with, kind of abstracted here, living in ways that ensure the attainment and continued satisfaction of human needs for present and future generations. We're all familiar with that text. And her elders were really quiet and kind of frowning, and she thought, well, they're going to turn me down. But they didn't. They said, go. You need to go, and you need to go educate those people. You need to carry them a message, because what they said is, that sounds to me like they're just trying to find a way to keep on taking. It's not our right to keep taking. When your feet hit the ground in the morning, we should be thinking, what is it we have to give? And in that one story, we see two lenses on this notion of relationship between people and the land, right? Are we primarily consumers of natural resource, or are we in fact givers, linked in reciprocity with the world that sustains us? And so with that tiny example, what I want to do is to just ask this question: what are the essential ideas from traditional knowledge, from Indigenous science, that tend to get lost in this monoculture? And in the interest of time, there's no way I can survey all of that. I'm so grateful that you have the traditional ecological knowledge section, who I'm sure has done this good work for you about these well-recognized, documented examples in which Indigenous science has led to new models for so-called sustainability. There are tons of papers out there, reviews, et cetera. If you're, this one came from Yale. I just loved the graphics, so there we go. A summary of the ways in which ecologists are learning from Indigenous peoples. The one study that I want to spend just a little bit of time on just came out, probably you saw this as well, of the UN report that suggests that as we look at biodiversity decline all over the planet, there are some notable locales where biodiversity decline is slow, not invisible, but slow. And those places are Indigenous homelands. When you look at this well-known map of biodiversity hotspots, and then you overlay Indigenous language diversity onto plant diversity, there's almost a 1-for-1 match. What is this correlation between Indigenous cultural diversity and biodiversity? The UN study highlights many causal effects. Indigenous land management, for one. This notion of the integration of the well-being of land and people, important philosophical difference between Western and Indigenous ways of being. This notion that people have to participate in the land in order for the land to be healthy, as opposed to our dominant conservation paradigm, which says keep people out. Nature and people are a bad mix. The worldview of Indigenous knowledge says, be careful, maintain balance, but that's how people participate. People are, again, linked in reciprocity with the living world, and in fact, human activity can generate and maintain biodiversity. But for the most part, the most, for me, compelling outcome of that study was to say that cultural values of Indigenous peoples, of the Indigenous worldview, as well as the practices, contribute to maintenance of biodiversity. Because Indigenous science, also known as traditional ecological knowledge, integrates nature and culture, it balances some of the inherent limitations of strictly scientific ways of knowing. And of course, it represents an exceptional long-term record of adaptation to ecological change, including climate change. We also know that around the world, Indigenous nations are really the sources of inspiring models for sustainability. The one I always like to talk about is the Menominee Forest, where I've been privileged to spend a lot of time. It looks like an old growth forest, and it is managed according to Indigenous principles in such a way that economic revenue is derived for the entire community, and yet the forest is essentially intact. It is a model of the ways in which human participation in the landscape can promote mutual thriving. And so with that very tiny introduction to these ideas, I really see our role as a community of ecologists is to support, I say students, but also each other, all of us, our community, to support one another in flourishing within the conventions, the institutions of science and ecology in which we live, but also to change the system towards authentic inclusion of these multiple ways of knowing. And decolonizing ecology asks that we do both of those things. Decolonizing ecology asks that at most fundamental that we see the world with two lenses, or at least recognize that there are at least two lenses by which we see the natural world. This wonderful graphic made by one of my students exemplifies this idea of two-eyed seeing, a phrase that was put forward by Merdina Marshall and Cheryl Bartlett, who came to understand the power of bringing together these ways of knowing. And how do we learn to see with both eyes? I would paraphrase, or actually quote, Kenny Ausubel from Bioneers. This falls into the category of one of those things. I wish I'd written that. We're going to need the enduring knowledge of Indigenous science as well as the best of leading edge Western science. It's high tech meets high tech. Good, no? It is from this spirit that I want to bring your attention to a really important document that maybe some of you have seen. Maybe you were among the thousands of signatories to the Indigenous Science Statement. When the March for Science came to attention several years ago, we wanted to participate, but it was troubling to say the March for Science. Well, which science are we talking about? So Indigenous scientists, ecologists got together to write the Indigenous Science Statement, which basically says, I don't have time to read all of it, of course. Let me just find that little piece here that I wanted to share with you. Indigenous science provides a wealth of knowledge and a powerful alternative paradigm by which we understand the natural world and our relation to it. Embedded in cultural frameworks of respect, reciprocity, responsibility, and reverence, Indigenous science lies within a worldview where knowledge is coupled to responsibility and human activity is aligned with ecological principles rather than against them. Let us march not just for science, but for sciences. And this is available on the Center for Native Peoples website and elsewhere. So what I wanted to do is to share with you in this effort to decolonize science, to engage in two-eyed seeing, a different metaphor, not the fortress. How do we dismantle that fortress, not the forest, in order that we can go forward in this shared enterprise? And the metaphor that really guides our work at the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, and that we offer and share, is this notion of the garden, of cultivating a mutualism among knowledge systems, not one or the other, but a mutualism, a complementary relationship between them. And this metaphor really comes organically from Indigenous science, the genius of Indigenous polyculture, of the Three Sisters Garden, which you probably know well. Why the garden metaphor? Because both traditional and scientific knowledge are rooted in knowledge of the earth. Because a garden grows and develops, we don't have all of the answers through either lens, but can we grow and develop together in such a way that we have a more plentiful garden? Importantly, in a Three Sisters Garden, there is no compromise of identity. right? We're not talking about blending these kinds of knowledges. We're talking about having them live and be nurtured side by side. And as you probably know about the Three Sisters polyculture, in knowledge as well as in the garden, it's more productive together if we move to not have Indigenous knowledge erased, but have it be central. And it is with mutual benefit for land and people. Oops, oh, I didn't realize, here we go, let me just do this. So the Three Sisters garden, as you probably know, is made up of corn, beans, and squash, which each play both a nutritional role, a soil ecology role, a biodiversity role. I don't have time to say too much more about it, but the Three Sisters garden involves all of these plants together. And as we think about a knowledge garden, in addition to a food garden, if traditional knowledge is represented in ecological sciences at all, it is almost always as a sidebar, as kind of a folkloric detail of, oh, did you know people used to think this? When in fact, what we're thinking about is that traditional knowledge is the elder knowledge. Traditional knowledge is the knowledge that is whole, that has mind, body, emotion, and spirit. It has both p-values and cultural values. And so that is the knowledge which creates the intellectual scaffolding for the knowledge mutualism, and that it takes a central place, not a sidebar, in this metaphor. And so the corn we plant first in a Three Sisters garden so that it can be strong and tall and nurture that first. And then we add the beans. We have to plant those seconds. And beans we think about in their power, in their fertilization, in their endless wandering and curiosity to be a metaphor for Western science. And so those beans in a Three Sisters garden don't run rampant. Have you ever done that? Have you ever planted beans without having your poles nearby? It's a mess, right? It becomes destructive. It overruns all of the other plants in the garden. It tends to create a monoculture. It creates, there's no guidance. And so we think about how might beans and corn, how might scientific and indigenous science, Western and indigenous sciences work together in order to guide that being? Could we have a model of knowledge generation which is in fact informed by indigenous principles? And I want to say at this point that when I talk about these indigenous principles, they are well known, they're part of the canon of indigenous thought, but they don't live there only. You recognize probably already many of these notions which are precious to you and practiced by you as well. But what we know is that those beans flower best in between the leaves of the corn. And metaphorically, what are those leaves? What are those principles? In indigenous thinking, we call them the 5 R's of environmental philosophy, that what guides our inquiry, what guides our problem solving, what guides our decision making are these principles of respect, relationship, responsibility, reciprocity, and indeed reverence. And these leaves of corn, could these be part of our holism, decolonizing Western science to incorporate these cultural values in addition to the power of p-values? This is that notion of reuniting knowledge and responsibility for knowledge, so that the questions we ask, the approaches that we take are guided by cultural values. We turn next to thinking about the squash. What role does the squash play in this symbiosis? The squash, of course, keeps the weeds suppressed. It keeps the soil cool, and it is a deterrent to many herbivores. In other words, it creates a climate where the beans and the corn can work together. And so we think about the role of the squash in creating an educational, research, problem-solving climate where both scientific traditions can work together. Willie Ermine has this great phrasing for what the squash does and what we might do as ecological practitioners. Could we create a place between worldviews, where both are present, where both are acknowledged, that opens up the possibility for configuring new research and knowledge production that are mutually developed with respect for cross-cultural interaction? If we had institutions that were like squashes, a student like myself 40 years ago and a student who enters the university today would find a home and not alienation. So, while I have your ear, while we're talking about decolonizing ecology, let me share just a vision. How many of you, you might not want to raise your hand, have often thought that, gosh, those NSF or fill in the blank USDA, whoever, review criteria really don't match the work that I want to do. And yet, that's where I have to work. Those are the criteria of what is good research questions and good research approaches. I don't know about you, but I feel really hamstrung by that. And so colleagues and I have thought, well, what would it be like if we could generate knowledge guided by other philosophies, other principles, so that we're not only decolonizing science, but indigenizing science and bringing these ways forward? Here's what I think about of these new research criteria. I think this may be too small for you to read, so let me read you a few. I want to submit a grant proposal where the criteria are: does the research demonstrate respect for humans and non-human persons? Does it promote responsibility for knowledge? Does it support reciprocity between people and biota? Does it support the sovereignty of knowledge and culture? Does it promote intergenerational equity? Does it acknowledge community knowledge holders? Does it recognize the land as teacher? Does it promote equitable sharing? Is it grounded in humility? I want to write that grant proposal. And I bet you do too. And so might we, again, think about how might we ask research questions, frame our approaches, where the land is the source of knowledge, where traditional ecological knowledge and philosophy is at the center, guiding our inquiry, and that we create this ethical space of engagement where these knowledge systems can work together. There's a bit of a myth, though, about the three sisters, because there's a fourth sister. Oops, sorry, this is what I want to do. The fourth sister, the ones who's saving the seeds, who's preparing the grounds, who are planting the seeds. And of course that fourth sister is us, right? We are the teachers, we are the scholars, we are the practitioners, and we are responsible for tending that knowledge garden so that all the species of knowledge can be productive and work together so that this system, this garden of knowledge is far more productive of sustainability solutions than any one of them alone. And so we have to think about how do we tend the TEK part of that garden, of that knowledge garden. Much of this is being done today in Indigenous communities all over the world in tending to language revitalization. But we can also, within our own communities, foster respect for sovereignty. We can give territorial acknowledgement to the places where our scientific institutions stand. We can protect biocultural landscapes, not just biological landscapes. We can educate for the priorities of other communities, protect cultural resources. But in this audience in particular, we are most responsible here for tending the SEK garden. What might we do as ecologists in this journey toward decolonization to tend the science garden? Can we decouple science from scientism? Scientism being that notion that science is the only way, the valid way to look at the world? Can we have a plurality of sciences? Free science from commodification so that science is not understood as property. Can we train translators for more effective science storytelling so that what is built inside of the forest I keep saying that. I think I like forests better than fortresses. That what is generated inside the fortress comes out and flows into and engages with the landscape. Can we incorporate cultural values into the work that we do? I heard today that there was a session here at ESA whose title included the word love. A powerful motivator. When we think of that medicine wheel again, we protect what we love, no? So engaging with our cultural values. Can we couple knowledge to responsibility and break down that barrier between being a good scientist and being a powerful advocate? Our silence will not save us. I don't think there needs to be that wall there. We couple our responsibility and privilege of being ecologists to the responsibility to raising our voices. And can we explore these new paradigms about human relationships with the living world? Much of my career I've spent in doing and thinking about restoration ecology. But it didn't take long in doing that work, which I love so much, to realize that in many cases, it's not the land that's broken. It's our relationship to land that's broken. It's our relationship to land that creates mine tailings, that creates, you fill in the blank of the wasteland of your choice, right? So how can we as ecologists who are involved in creating the knowledge that allows us to heal those places, mustn't we also invest our energies in healing our relationship to those places? Decolonizing ecology gives us an opportunity to break down some of the barriers and the limitations and restraints on the questions we ask and the tools that we use. It creates an opportunity to shift our assumptions about human interactions with land. I think a research priority that we have going forward is to really explore this notion based in Indigenous thinking that we have to participate in the well-being of nature. We can't stand back and put a fence around it. What are the ways in which human beings can be beneficial actors in communities? The Indigenous canon the canon of Indigenous science is full of many examples in which the plants flourish because people are harvesting them in the right way. The fish flourish because people are intervening in that watershed in a particular way. There are many such examples, and this provides a wellspring of research opportunities and partnership opportunities among ecologists. I also want to say, in closing, again, back to my students who often ask just the right questions. A senior who was graduating, who said to me, "You know, I came to the ecological sciences because I love the natural world, but I'm not sure that I belong here. My science education wrings the love right out of you when it's all about data and p-values and not about doing anything." What a moment of clarity from that student. And I take guidance from that. I'm proud to be a member of a society that does something, that doesn't just act, doesn't just hold knowledge, but acts upon that knowledge. But I think we have a ways to go before we again think about the fact that we as human beings, as ecologists, have these 4 ways of knowing, and that we can bring mind, body, emotion, and spirit to our work. And in that way, we move to the time when Indigenous science and Western science include cultural values. Can we be inspired by the medicine wheel, by Indigenous models of knowledge generation, so that the questions that we pose and answer are not only what is true, but what is right? And so that our work as ecologists, on behalf of generations to come, on behalf of the beings who have been our teachers, that we are changing hearts as well as minds. Mi'u, miigwech, thank you for listening. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. You're very kind. Be happy to take questions. Thank you. Would it be possible to turn up the lights so we can see each other as we converse? Oh, you're beautiful.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Anne-Marie, and I'm over here on your left.
Oh, there we go. Thank you.
I'm a graduate student at Iowa State, but my question is about how you communicate a lot of this knowledge, because I think you do it very masterfully. And from listening to your lecture and reading your book, my mom grew up on like a very small Micronesian island, and sometimes when she's telling about her upbringing to people who are outsiders, she falls into this sort of trap of like, oh, the coconut is the tree of my people, and how do you avoid, like, you navigate this line very well of avoiding like promoting sometimes harmful stereotypes or maybe boxing in Native people to these ideas we already have of them, and still being able to like infuse your stories with emotion and tell these stories very well.
Thank you so much. That's a really powerful question. As we talk about how do we become cross-cultural translators, it's essential, because what you're describing is a way that scientists may dismiss Indigenous knowledge because it's not in a way that they really grasp. So what I've tried to do as both a writer and as a teacher is to be bilingual, to really know both of those communities so you can meet people where they are. And when you're talking with Native people, you may use different metaphors and different ways of thinking, and when you're talking to a scientific audience, you use their metaphors, and then you bring them together. So meet people where they are, and then take them someplace they did not expect to go. That's my favorite. Thank you.
Bruce Byers. I'm an independent consultant and writer, and thank you very much for that thought-provoking talk. I wanted to get your reaction, if possible, to a little bit of a different view about all of this. I've always sort of thought of science as having two sides of a coin, a reductionist science and a holistic science. And I've always thought of the colonizing fortress in your metaphor as essentially the worldview of the Middle Eastern monotheisms, which I think led naturally into Western reductionist science. Whereas I think ecology is a holistic science, which sort of started, I think, perhaps as a rebellion against that reductionist viewpoint with people like Alexander von Humboldt and Aldo Leopold.
Yes.
So the dichotomy, well, I guess I would see holistic science as embracing or being very similar to what you're calling indigenous science, and reductionist science being something different.
Yes, I agree with you. I agree with you. And that's why I wanted to take pains to say that this isn't just the indigenous worldview. It is the whole interactive, holistic worldview. But I think that in the history of science, or the history of ecological sciences, with their origins in natural history, which embody this wholeness, right, of mind, body, emotion, and spirit, and engagement with the natural world. We, I think, within the history of ecology, suffered a little bit from physics envy, right? And creating a hyper-quantitative emphasis And this is really a call to, perhaps to include our roots in natural history and in that holism. But I agree with you completely, yeah. Thanks for that insight.
Hi, Robin. Thank you so much for a talk that resonated so much with, I'm sure, many of us and me personally. My question for you is about this. So I'm a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology, and I can take so much of the inspiration that you have, and I can do that in my work. I can model it. I'm at a career stage where that's a safe move for me because I got to where I am doing different things. And so I get stuck as an advisor of students who share these values around responsibility coming with knowledge and around all of the things that you talked about. But for those of them who want to be professors and who want to be, research scientists, I feel stuck because I know that for them, I have to help them with a strategy of publishing papers. I have to, if they want those positions and they want to be able to be in those leadership roles, I have to get them there. And it seems like a lot to ask them, or even to encourage them to try to do the both and to take on responsibility for some of these other things early in their career. So I want to know how you do that. How do you help earlier emerging ecologists, especially from traditional cultures, from underrepresented backgrounds, navigate getting to the places that they want to land professionally without compromising their commitment to those values?
Yes, it's such an important question, and it is a matter of as I said, helping our students not only navigate the system that exists, but also changing that system. That we who have the privilege of tenure, who have come up through the ranks, for example, to say, well, now I am going to publish differently. Now I'm going to use a different voice. Now I'm going to advocate in a very public way. And then we model what is normal, and we change the expectations of what does it mean to be an academic or an institutional scientist. But we can't, and I respect greatly what you're saying, we can't jeopardize the future of our students. We want them to enter the professoriate. We want them to become practicing ecologists, but we want them to do it differently. So I don't find a way around the both and, but to support our students by modeling it and then making it okay. When they see you, their esteemed, cherished professor, doing it, they say, it's okay for me to do it too. And you make it okay. So thank you.
My name is Madhusudan Katti, and I'm from India. And I've been coming to these meetings for a long time as well. And I want to express my deep appreciation for seeing you up there giving this rousing call for decolonizing ecology and decolonizing science. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for bringing that in this big stage. And I'm fully on board with that project, but I was live tweeting your talk as much as I could, trying to share the message. And I got a question from somebody in response to the letter on the March for Science. Mm-hmm. And I want to get your reaction to this, because this is the kind of thing that I've heard a lot when I've critiqued the March for Science as well.
Yeah.
So this person is saying, it's pretty clear that the March for Science is opposing the Trump regime's ignoring the findings on climate science, pollution, toxins, abortion, etc. Scientists are leaving government in droves. So a question for any critique of March for Science is, what does it do for that fight? And I get frustrated when this question comes up, and I'm curious how you respond to this kind of this activist move to sort of shove everything into one box and push aside these indigenous and decolonizing concerns.
I want to hear what your answer is too, because I get this question as well, and I think that's what we were really trying to advocate for is pluralism in science, to say that there are many sciences which contribute, and in terms of the increase in science skepticism, science denial that surrounds us, I think that we can lay that at the feet of many causes which are familiar to us. But I think we have to also recognize our own complicity in that.
Yes.
That if we use language and ask questions that seem marginal to the critical issues that we are facing, that can amplify science skepticism. And so I think it's important for us to be very clear about what our agendas are. So thank you for that comment, and I'd love to hear how you answer it as well.
One answer that I had come up with during the conversations when the march first happened, and I had this push-pull towards the march, and my feeling was that, as you pointed out, science, mainstream science, has always been a handmaiden of power. So this sudden sort of push, that we have to save science because of this administration ignores the history of how science has always been aligned with power in many ways. And my sense is that a lot of this push for the March for Science is motivated more by sensing a loss of that relationship to power rather than addressing the broader set of issues that are coming, that have been brought up by this current political climate. Mm-hmm. So I'm an immigrant to this country as well. I'm still waiting in this long queue for a green card with a lot of uncertainty over my, being able to function as a professor, as a scientist, because, the immigration climate is pretty bad right now. So that uncertainty is part of what I live with every day while I'm trying to do science, while I'm mentoring students, while I'm trying to bring
Yes.
to decolonize science.
Yes.
So that's kind of what I try to point out when people sort of say we have to set all that aside and just talk about, how science is, there's a war on science. And I don't believe that there is a war on science in that sense. I think that we have to engage in the broader cultural struggle, and that activist struggle also has to be expanded and has to include the diverse identities of people who are engaged in science, but also face all the other things that are coming from, not just here, in India,
certainly.
in Brazil,
Yeah.
Everywhere
Right.
we are facing these kinds of pressures.
Yeah. Well, thank you for persisting. Thank you. Yes, question over here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Robin, for your talk. Greetings from Chile. I'm Ricardo Rozzi from the Long-Term Socio-Ecological Research Network in Chile and at the Center for Environmental Philosophy at the University of North Texas. So the criticism against monoculture, that is critical, and I am thankful that you bring this up. Now, a short comment, and maybe if we can open something to think and continue the conversation. In order to dissolve the monoculture, I think it's really important also to know that Western civilization is not a monoculture. And just three kind of quick, iconic examples. Beautifully, the garden. Epicurus. Epicurus founded a school called the Garden in Athens. He was a disciple of Aristotle. And the invitation was to be a gardener and to cultivate the garden. That was wisdom. You cannot be a wise person if you are not able to cultivate the garden. So philosophy, which comes from physis, which means nature, at the very beginning of Western civilization was connected. That's one example. Second example, Giambattista Vico. Maybe few of you have heard his name, an Italian. The same time that René Descartes, contemporaneous of René Descartes. Giambattista Vico never got a job at the university. He was in Sicilia. And why is important the dichotomy between Giambattista Vico and René Descartes? Because Giambattista Vico said, we invent realities. Numbers are an invention. And René Descartes, by saying that nature is written in mathematical language, which is taking Galileo Galilei to a political sphere, is inaugurating what is called the second modernity, which means capitalism. Mm-hmm. So, to have numbers as the deepest metaphysical assumption of modernity is one political economic project which is an assumption. I'm not saying that numbers are not important, but their overwhelming presence needs to be explained in a political context of power, and there's where modernity comes with coloniality and coloniality with modernity. But Western has been, nevertheless, been resilient and diverse. It's not a monoculture. Many communities, many schools of thought that because are not in power have protested against that monoculture. And now I come to today, which is a little bit with a colleague of India. In this complex cosmopolitan world, I find this decolonizing also Western civilization and Western science from the great acceleration that begins in the 1950s after Second World War II, where neoliberalism transformed not numbers in the ultimate assumption of the world, but money. So it's more reductionist. A philosopher in Latin America called this the monetarization. So from modernity to monetarity. And I think it's very timely that we do this reflection. And the reason I wanted to do this comment, because in this resistance that is complex and multifaceted in indigenous and local communities and also among scientists, we have a chance to facilitate this dissolution of monoculture to pluriverses by also knowing our own traditions. And so it's not Native American originally, we are all somehow linked to some places. And I wanted to finish with two comments, or two questions. One, if there are some thinkers in the Western tradition that have been influential to you, which come to your mind by free association. And second, how do you see these struggles against something as anachronic as a wall between two neighbor countries that overrides? Yeah. So in that we are together. So, but we really, I think what is the common at the end, and I come back, we want to dissolve the monoculture. I think we have options at hand. It's only less than 1% that are having a power on a monoculture. So I see opportunities by knowing our own diversity.
Yes, I really appreciate your point. And I think in closing, what I would say is that if when we look at this, what seems to be a monolith, the monoculture of Western science and its coupling to capitalism, is to recognize that in the long history of our intellectual traditions, it is only within the last 400 years, really an eye blink of time in human history, that we have had this notion of what it is to be human, alive in the natural world, to be consumers, commodified, not gardeners, as you suggested to us. And that it's really important to recognize that this is a unique moment in history that we have come through, and that we can choose again. For most of our history as human people, we have not lived with this worldview and the constraints of capitalism and commodification of knowledge and alienation from nature. That is not our history, that is not who we are. And so this process of decolonizing is decolonizing for each and every one of us to remember who we are as people and reclaim that as members of the garden. So thank you all. Great questions.